came down to our name. It was hard for us to sell tickets in America on the Nederlands-Amerikaanse stoomvaartmaatschappij. And everyone was already calling us something else anyway. So we did what these days you would call a rebranding. And we went from this to this. And that was the last time we were behind the curve. And by just a few years later, we had already taken over 1,000 trips with nearly 500,000 passengers. And things were only going to get better. Holland America Line was about to join one of the largest movements of people in the history of the world. For as long as America has been America, people have traveled from far away to make a new life in the United States. Before Holland America Line came around, it was expensive, it was difficult, and it was often extremely dangerous. In the early 1800s, long before our steamships, immigrants literally risked their lives to get across the Atlantic.
Immigration from, of course, the point of view from the Netherlands started in the 1830s. Sometimes they sailed as regular passengers with their own cabin, but most of them didn't have a lot of money because poverty was a reason to migrate, and they stayed in between decks. So they didn't have their own cabin, they just stayed in whatever bed was provided for them.
So conditions on those ships before Holland America Line were miserable. You had tween decks, or what you may know as steerage, where most of the immigrants traveled, were tiny. They were only like 5 feet tall. There was no ventilation, rampant typhus, dysentery, starvation, and the passage could almost take a month. Those sailing ships before we came around were often called coffin ships, for a very good reason. At times, 1 out of every 10 passengers died before reaching America. By the time our steamships came around, things had gotten better. The trip was shorter, but the conditions on the other liners were still pretty terrible. And yet, here's the thing, nearly 11 million people immigrated to the United States in steerage. So we had to figure out how to get some of those passengers. And look, it wasn't going to be easy. The competition was ferocious, especially because the other companies were, well, let's say they were willing to play a little fast and loose with the truth.
It cost $10 to cross from Rotterdam to New York. $10 to an immigrant in the beginning of the 20th century was a lot of money. And they wanted the voyage that was safe and reliable. Immigrants were poor people, basically. They didn't go to travel agents, they didn't study brochures, but they'd go down to the railway station or the pub or the post office, and they would see these giant posters of liners going to America. So word spread that a ship with 2 smokestacks was safer than a ship with 1 smokestack. But a ship with 3 smokestacks was even safer. There's no correlation between smokestacks and safety, but they would look at the posters and count the smokestacks in the posters and pick that ship to spend their $10 on. Well, companies, thankfully Holland America didn't do it, used to add fake smokestacks to their ships so they would have more stacks on the top so the immigrants would go on their ship, so they called them dummy smokestacks. The second big story of that era, the immigrants had heard that if they ate raw onions for a month before they left Europe, they wouldn't get seasick. Total fallacy. There's no correlation between raw onions and seasickness.
Okay, first of all, we really appreciate it if you don't try the raw onion cure, yeah? The science has offered us plenty of methods to treat seasickness that won't make you a social outcast in the dining room. Raw onions. But the point is this. Holland America Line had to figure out how to get some of those immigrants on board of our ships. And again, we weren't the fastest, we weren't the biggest, and we definitely weren't the cheapest. And we were not going to cheat by adding fake smokestacks to our ships. But despite all that competition, eventually 1 out of every 10 immigrants who traveled steerage to the US did so on a Holland America Line ship. 1 out of every 10. And you know why? Because we treated those immigrants like human beings deserve to be treated. And that all started at home in Rotterdam.
So here we're actually at the Wilhelminakade, but at this side it's called Holland America Quay. And this is the main street, you can say, in Rotterdam. So basically, where we're at, this square kilometer is the history of Holland America Line. Just on the opposite side, you have the Royal Yacht Club, where actually the deed, when it was started, the company, was signed, dined, and wined. If you walk a little bit up along the quay, you will find Hotel New York, which was the original head office of Holland America Line, and I have heard so many stories of people going there, trembling knees, and how happy they were when they finally got on board.
That building, which served both as our offices and terminal, is where it all started, and you can still see our name on the facade. Downstairs, immigrants came to purchase their tickets and get ready for their long journey. And actually, the baggage area now is a really nice restaurant with an amazing view. Upstairs were the offices, and today there are even a few rooms named after our founders. After the migrants purchased their tickets, they'd wait for a ship to arrive to take them to America. And sometimes they waited a few hours, but usually they waited for days and days.
When they stayed in Rotterdam, up till the 1890s, they mostly went, or I think all of them went to private boarding houses. And in the earlier days, the people of the boarding houses, well, they were not that fair in the prices people had to pay. And people like Pleet and Reuglin, who were the founders of the Holland America Line, also saw this. So at the end of the 19th century, they built their own emigrant hotel.
And we built it just a few blocks away from our head office, and it was a huge part of the reason that we were so successful in those early days. And this was much more than just a hotel. We had a kosher kitchen, English lessons, classes on American civics, and doctors and nurses who checked for lice and disease. And when the immigrant finally got on board, they found something totally different from our competition. First of all, we did away with steerage class, renaming it immigrants class, where we served 3 square meals in an actual mess hall, rather than make the poor and hungry eat in their rooms like the other companies did. For example, let's have a look at the menu of the turn of the century. Monday, sauerkraut, smoked bacon, potatoes, plum duff. Still have no idea what plum duff is, but I think with a little mayonnaise must be fine. First class passengers had it even better. Oysters on the half shell, seared duck. Have a look at the name of that ship, the Potsdam. We've repeated a lot of ship names in our history, but there's never been a second Potsdam. I think it works in Dutch, but it didn't really sound right in English, I guess. Now, offering 3 square meals in a dining room might seem like a small thing, but it was actually a massive innovation, because it meant that 3 times a day, rain or shine, those passengers would leave their quarters and their rooms could be cleaned. So very quickly we got the nickname the Spotless Fleet. And this wasn't just about being tidy. Everything from the doctors at our hotel to the cleanliness on board of our ships was all about getting passengers to New York in a healthy condition, because healthy passengers made it through Ellis Island.
Just south of where I am right now is Ellis Island, the great immigration station, where from 1892 to 1924, 18 million people passed through. Now the immigrants were not allowed to come up to the piers of New York. The ship had to drop anchor south of here in the lower bay, and they would take them off in barges, tenders, or ferries, and all the third-class steerage passengers would go directly to Ellis Island, where beginning at about 9 in the morning, they would be processed by gruff customs and immigration people and doctors known as 30-second specialists, as they hooked under eyelids and poked into ears looking for diseases. They were processed, and many of them were cleared by noon, would catch a ferry over to Manhattan or even here to Jersey City and start working in a factory the same afternoon in a pre-arranged job. They wanted to be Americans quickly. They wanted the idea that the streets were paved with gold. You could make your riches in America.
And by the way, if a passenger was rejected at Ellis Island, you know who had to pay for the return voyage? We did. But that's only part of why we did all of this. The main reason was, of course, that the people that made it through told their friends and relatives about us. Almost 99% of all the immigrants we carried on our spotless fleet were cleared at Ellis Island. So word spread about our fine service on board and business was exploding. So it was time for us to build our first luxury liner, the New Amsterdam. And I could seriously gush about her all day, but let's let the New York Times do the honors.
The New Holland America liner, New Amsterdam, reached Hoboken after her maiden passage across the Atlantic yesterday afternoon. The ship, which is the largest flying the Dutch flag, as well as the best passenger vessel yet built for the New York Rotterdam trade, resembles outwardly the other Holland America ships. There is a Dutch smoking room, a Japanese tea room. The social hall is furnished in the Empire style, and will surely be one of the most popular apartments on the new ship.
Now that's what I call a good review. And by the way, you may notice that New Amsterdam has masts. It never used sails, but we put masts on the ship to assure worried immigrants that the ship was safe and sound. Sort of our version of dummy smokestacks, but it worked. Immigrants flocked to Holland America Line, and the stories are endless. Johnny Weissmuller, Olympic athlete, and the very famous Tarzan. He immigrated to the States on Rotterdam 3. Herbert Hoover, Cary Grant, Katharine Hepburn, Clark Gable, Deborah Carr, Louis Armstrong. They all traveled on Holland America Line ships. And we can even take credit for some of the greatest comedies the last 50 years. Billy Crystal's grandfather immigrated on one of our ships. So without us, there wouldn't be When Harry Met Sally, no City Slickers, not even City Slickers 2, so you're welcome. And there's of course this recognizable fellow. He traveled to the United States for the very first time on board of our ships, the Rotterdam, the fourth Rotterdam, flagship of our fleet and our very first ship of state. Rotterdam 4 was built in 1908, and she was amazing. She was the largest ever Dutch ship. She was the official seagoing palace of the Royal Dutch government, sort of the Dutch version of the SS France or the Queen Mary. She was the first ocean liner in the world to have a glass enclosed promenade deck, which may not seem like a big deal, but it would be actually 4 more years before another ship had such a modern and forward-looking feature. And that ship was the Titanic. And actually, Titanic is part of our story in more ways than one. In 1912, when White Star Line launched the Titanic, one of our founders sent his son George to scout the new ship. He dined with the ship's designers, he met with all the officials from White Star Line, and he sent telegrams to the captain of the Noordam, a Holland America Line ship that was crossing the Atlantic just ahead of the Titanic. And the captain of the Noordam actually warned him for the eyes ahead. If you listen carefully in the film, you can hear our ship mentioned. But of course, there was no help. Our founder's son was among the 1,500 that died on that tragic voyage. But that tragedy wouldn't prevent us from forging forward, nor would World War I or immigration quotas, not even prohibition. We just continued to do what we had always done. We found a way to think differently.
In 1929, Wall Street crashed, and the passenger ship industry to Europe plummeted by 50%. A million people crossed in 1930, 500,000 5 years later. So Holland America, like all the companies, was hemorrhaging money. So in America, we had prohibition, you couldn't drink. So they developed an idea of one-night cruises for $10, where you would sail from New York at 5 p.m. You would get to the 3-mile limit at 7 p.m. They could open up the bars legally because they were past the 3-mile limit. Americans could drink themselves through the whole night and hopefully be sober enough to walk ashore the next morning. $10 booze cruises. Cruising was like Hollywood movies in the 30s. It was a form of escapism. So Holland America emphasized the nutrients in sea air. It would calm your nerves. You would worry less about your financial trouble. You'll come back when you need.
So our approach to prohibition was so successful that despite worldwide economic panic, we built our most luxurious ship ever, the New Amsterdam 2, still considered to be, along with the Normandy of France, one of the most beautiful ships ships ever built. And again, gonna let the New York Times handle this one.
British observers who landed at Southampton after making the overnight journey to inspect the ship were deeply impressed with her, not only as the most modern thing in marine architecture, but also as a distinct and unique achievement in art. The New Amsterdam is the greatest ship ever to come out of Holland, and those who have seen her predict that she will produce a sensation in New York unlike that of any other vessel in a North Atlantic trade.
Sensation. Perfect word to describe New Amsterdam too. She was our very first ship to feature something called ocean liner design. And you see, before New Amsterdam, our ships looked like home. Dark interiors, fireplaces, heavy fabrics. You were supposed to feel like you were ashore in a Dutch villa and not at sea. But with New Amsterdam too, we tried something different.
It was Art Deco at sea, it was magnificent, it had everything right about it. It was floating ginger arches with sleek stainless banisters, ebony and modern decor, out with the chocolate rooms and the heavy carpets. She was instantly one of the most popular ships. In fact, she was dubbed the ship of tomorrow because she was so modern inside.
And with New Amsterdam too, we even revolutionized entertainment on board. In the earlier days, our lounges featured a piano for the guests to play, like in the parlors of the old country. That was the onboard entertainment. A few drinks and the hope that someone else crossing the Atlantic with you would be able to play a few popular songs. Well, these days we do still that couple of drinks thing, but now we provide the piano player. And that all started on New Amsterdam. It even had an entire theater. New Amsterdam featured performances by all kinds of artists. And fast forward 100 years, we went from this to this. And the past was gone. The ocean liner was the future. But less than a year after New Amsterdam made her first voyage, everything changed.
War breaks out in Europe. 2 days after Germany's surprise attack on Holland, France and England have declared war on the Nazis. With widespread fighting imminent, countless civilians are left to wonder, where will we go that is safe?
My parents smuggled themselves, literally smuggled themselves across the Polish border in early '39.
We arrived at the Rotterdam train station around midnight on the 25th of March, without any money at all. We spent 2 weeks in Rotterdam waiting for the ship to sail. Finally, one evening in early April, we boarded our ship. For the first 3 days, our vessel threaded her way carefully across the English Channel to avoid the mines.
It was tense all the way. There were frequent rumors of U-boats and of turning back to Europe. At night, the ship was blacked out, dark. The potholes had been painted over, drapes and curtains were drawn by late afternoon, and only low wattage bulbs were used in the lounges and in the cabins.
We were in the English Channel and the war had started, and the ship turned out all the lights, and we laid all night in the English Channel because of fear of submarines. And then the next day we started the trip to New York, and partway through the trip we saw the ocean all around us was covered with logs, and it was a Canadian lumber ship that had been torpedoed by the Germans, and we picked up the survivors.
On the day we finally rounded Land's End and headed out into the open Atlantic, the ship's radio brought us the news of Hitler's surprise attack.
Rotterdam was bombed, the whole city center was bombed. Around 850 people lost their lives. Around 20,000 people lost their home, which is a lot. And also the harbor, the port was bombed.
During the bombardment, one of our largest ships, the Statendam, was hit. In the midst of the destruction, this symbol of our company burned and burned for days.
A lot of people were emotional about it. That Statendam, of course, it was burning, and they tried to save it, but they couldn't. The whole city center of Rotterdam was burning. I mean, 30,000 buildings were gone. You can't imagine how it must have been for people to live in the city at that moment. All those people having no homes, the fire, there was no water. Everything was broken. It must have been awful.
The Dutch government had wanted to be neutral, but now they had no choice. The war had come to the Netherlands. So they called on the Dutch ships of state to join the war effort. New Amsterdam II, our most luxurious ship yet, was to become a military vessel. She steamed to Halifax, where her military conversion began. From there she went to Singapore, where her millions of dollars of furniture and art were placed into storage. And on December 22nd, 1940, she entered service.
At the outbreak of World War II, I was in South Africa.
That's Cecil Renfield. When we interviewed him, he was 97 years old. He joined the Navy in South Africa and was transferred to the British Royal Navy to join the battle for Europe. The only way he could get home to fight was on board our New Amsterdam.
Before the war, I was a cabin boy on the old Orient line, and I knew a lot about merchant ships. And I knew about the New Amsterdam was, I would say, the pride of Holland in those days. Wow, it was the biggest ship I'd ever seen or ever been on. When we got on board that troop ship, it was packed. We were packed like sardines. If you lifted your head up, you cracked your head on the bunk above you.
All troop carriers were extremely crowded, and New Amsterdam was no different. Before the war, she could carry a little more than 1,200 passengers. During the war, at her capacity, she held over 8,000 troops at a time. Even the swimming pool was filled with enough bunks for 300 soldiers. But despite the cramped conditions, New Amsterdam maintained the world-famous Holland America Line service. For example, while most troop carriers only managed 2 hot meals a day, soldiers traveling on board of our New Amsterdam were treated 3 square meals. And the amount of food needed to feed these soldiers was frankly mind-boggling. Every single day, the ship's kitchen went through 240 gallons of milk, 80 bags of flour, 12,000 eggs, 1,000 pounds of bacon, 14,000 loaves of bread. When lamb stew was on the menu, it took 110 whole lambs. When beef brisket was on the menu, it took 4,000 pounds of beef. And by the way, just for a comparison, these days we use about 5,000 fewer eggs. Now, on the other hand, we have way more French onion soup and baked Alaska. But it's funny, what Cecil remembers isn't the brisket or the eggs, it's actually something much simpler.
The feeling of fear was always back in your mind. We'd heard through what we call the grapevine of so many other ships being sunk. And it was quite strange because on the New Amsterdam, we had no escort. There were no ships with us at all. We just sailed alone.
But the New Amsterdam was very fast and the German U-boats couldn't keep up with it. So she escaped, and being painted gray, she could slip into fog or disappear on the horizon.
By the time the war was over, New Amsterdam had steamed over 500,000 miles, carrying almost 400,000 troops, including tens of thousands for the invasion of Normandy. Only the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth carried more troops than our New Amsterdam, and they were twice her size. After the war, it took 13 months to return her to her former beauty, and it cost nearly as much as it did to build her in the first place. But it was worth it, because when she finally returned home to Rotterdam, it can only be described as a hero's welcome.
1946, 1 year after the war ended, it returned to Holland, and it steamed into Rotterdam, still scarred and rust of the great paint, and to the Dutch people, it was the symbol of liberation more than anything else, and they painted the Holland America stacks in the yellow, green, and white, and the people dubbed it the darling of the Dutch. We are truly free. The New Amsterdam has come back to Holland.
And the ship was welcomed like you would welcome a queen or a president, the new waterway in the river, there were a lot of ships really with flags and people alongside the quays really welcoming the ship back. And in a way you can say that for at least the people from Rotterdam, war really ended at the moment that the new Amsterdam was back in this city.
Of our 20 ships in the fleet, only 10 survived the war. And one of them, Rotterdam, was sunk 3 times. 3 times. And yet Rotterdam was the first ship to return to New York Harbor after the war was over.
In 1946, when the Rotterdam was the first liner to come back after the war, she sailed right on this path on the Hudson River. It probably was early morning at 7 a.m. Maybe a tugboat or two or a fireboat escorted her up the river. She was dressed in flags, and she slowly made her progress up to Hoboken, which would be a little further north than where I am right now, in Jersey City. But she'd make a graceful sight, and she looked pretty against the New York City skyline. You know, the new ship, morning, wonderful, a beginning.
And that was the end of the war, and the start of a whole new era. Okay, so something we haven't talked about yet is the thing that we do with the names of our ships. First of all our passenger ships end with the word. That's damn correct. Yeah. When we had cargo ships, they all ended with this dijk, as in the things that keep water from flooding a city. I'm telling you this for a reason, because the names of our ships are important to us. So important, in fact, that we repeat them over and over again. There have been 3 Volendams, 3 Rijndams, we've had 4 New Amsterdams, 5.5 Statendams. Yeah, one is technically New Statendam, but it still counts. And why do we do this? And remember what I said in the beginning, how stories help us learn from our past, become stronger from our failures, wiser from our victories. And how do you do that? Well, you do it by remembering and by honoring the past that continues to shape our future. And it matters. It really matters. On New Statendam's maiden voyage, I've met a man who you actually heard earlier, Fred. He escaped the Nazis in 1939 on Statendam 3. And he chose to cruise with us on New Statendam all those years later so he could reconnect to his past. In this way, our ships become time machines. They're keepers of your memories and those of your family. They echo with the voyages of the past. And of course, there's been one name that has returned and more than any other, Rotterdam. There have been 7 Rotterdams now in our history, but of all the Rotterdams, there's none more important to our story, none that better illustrates our hero's journey than Rotterdam 5, the Grande Dame of our spotless fleet. Here she is. September 1958, 50,000 people lined the banks of the Rotterdam shipyard to watch Queen Juliana christen her. She was stunning. She was the first ship to really and truly look like a modern cruise ship.
The Rotterdam was so unique, she didn't have a smokestack. She had twin uptakes on the outside, and her decor was very, very modern. Ships were becoming more like floating hotels, gymnasiums, swimming pools, shopping arcades, movie theaters. They were becoming really hotels at sea or resorts at sea. And the Rotterdam was one of the great statements of, well, extraordinary maritime design for her period.
And when we talk about extraordinary maritime design, we have to talk about Holland America Line's greatest contribution to cruising, the Lido Buffet. You can step in from the pool, grab a bite, and go back sunbathing. She was the future, and her timing, terrible. A month after she was launched, the world changed again.
In October 1958, the first jet flies from London to New York. The shipping industry announces flying is a fad, it will pass. It's a mere ripple in the road of travel. In 6 months, the airlines had 2/3 of all the business. In 5 years, 98%.
That plane took only 6 hours to cross the ocean. 6 hours. A trip that ocean liners made in 6 days. So this should have been the end of our story. If not for Rotterdam 5, Because just like we had innovated in the past, every detail of Rotterdam 5 seemed to predict the end of the transatlantic business and the beginning of something new. Take, for example, her staircase. There was a movable part that could be closed to create a first class and tourist class for transatlantic crossings. Or we could open it to create a single class ship which was perfect for cruising. Even the first and tourist class dining room were identical. Now, the first class dining room was just a little closer to the kitchen, so your potatoes were a bit warmer. But Rotterdam 5 was a huge success. She cruised the West Indies, Caribbean, South America, Europe, and in 1961 she began a yearly tradition of circumnavigating the world.
Some people would take the world cruise every year. It was like a floating clubhouse. They'd bring their own favorite foods, their own furniture, so they'd feel at home. It was magic. There were all sorts of stories. The lady who took 300 dresses for 95 days. What about the lady who took 2 suites? One was for her harp. What about the lady who took a second suite for her stuffed animal collection, which she traveled with around the world?
The best, though, is the woman who brought her plastic surgeon. Imagine, she left for a 95-day cruise and came back looking 20 years younger. That ship was a time machine.
She's also one of those ships that was beloved, a certain kind of chemistry that you don't build in the shipyard, but it's in the woodwork and the paneling that just engulfs people, so passengers and crew love that ship.
And if you want to have an amazing time machine experience, Rotterdam 5 is now a floating hotel in Rotterdam Harbor. You can go aboard, walk our halls, you can see the beautiful artwork and design, you can touch the steam engines, you can see the saltwater pool, you can explore the past right in front of you. It's honestly breathtaking. But you know what my favorite thing is? Every time we call in Rotterdam, as we pass by that grand old ship, she blows our horn to salute. Because Rotterdam 5 was more than just a beloved ship. She was the vessel that allowed us to go from being a fleet of ocean liners that occasionally cruised, making cruising our business. But by the time the 60s rolled around, we had entered another battleground in the cruising industry. As other fleets made the same adjustments we were making, we found ourselves once again in competition for passengers. So we had to find a unique advantage, and we had to do it fast. Because the 60s may have been swinging, the 70s brought only about oil embargoes and financial crises, so suddenly we had major choices to make. The first thing we did, we shut down our cargo operation. We had about 80 cargo ships in our history, the deck ships, but from that moment on, we never had another one. And things were starting to look bleak. I'll let Kees explain. Back in the 70s, he was on board one of our last few passenger ships, the Prinsendam.
There were only 3 or 4 passenger ships left, and that was not enough to sustain the company and pay for the overhead. So it was felt that we need to offer new and exciting adventures. In the mid-1970s, the company was associated with West Tours, a very successful tour company here in Alaska. So they decided, we're going to bring the Prinsendam to Alaska.
That's right. While the rest of the world was focused on cruising the warm waters of the Caribbean, we took one ship, one of our last ships, and we sent it thousands of miles in the wrong direction.
I was on the Prinsendam. That was just the very first ship slotted to go to Alaska. Alaska was different, very, very, very different than it is now. If you walked in Juneau, there were no jewelry shops like you find everywhere in the Caribbean. There were no tour buses. They used school buses. That was all what was available in those days. Sitka had 3 taxis, that was it.
A little bit like Iceland. So. Also, there was also another problem. Prinsendam was in Asia and had to get across the Pacific to start her first Alaska cruise, which was tricky in the days before GPS or computer-guided navigation.
This was supposed to be a 10-day North Pacific crossing. And this was in April. And we left Yokohama and it was dense fog. Couldn't see anything for days. So here we go, basically the old-fashioned way, dead reckoning. You estimate how fast the ship is going, you know your course, and you plot in the chart, every day where you are. So I'm on the bridge, and I look on the radar, and I look outside, and I look on the radar again, and I see land. It's supposed to be land for at least another day, to our estimate. So I called the captain, and I said, "Captain, oi, land in sight." He said, "What the hell are you talking about? It's not 1650, yeah, it's 1975. He said, "Come on the bridge, I see land." These are only snow-capped mountains, on Vancouver Island.
So they had arrived the full 24 hours too early. And remember what I said about never being behind the curve again? Well, it's kind of amazing that we were ahead of schedule of our very first Alaska cruise, because we were way ahead of everyone else when it came to Alaska. And it paid off. Thousands and thousands of people flocked to explore this new destination. So many, in fact, that we had to start bringing ships from New York over to the West Coast.
The ships needed to move from New York to Vancouver, and that's a long way. So we needed to come up with a cruise to do that make it attractive for people to say, "Hey, I've never been with a ship through the Panama Canal. Hey, there are interesting ports down in the Caribbean that we normally don't go to." The company always found a way to persevere. It's hard to say we did well and times are difficult, but it's not how you go in, but how you come out.
And in just a few years, we became the Alaska powerhouse. We bought a train and a resort, and we helped transform Alaska into what it is today, a top tourist destination in the world. And that one idea, Cruise Alaska, changed everything. The jet plane almost ruined us, but just by taking risks, by stepping out of what was comfortable, we survived. And don't get me wrong, jets are amazing. They can get us all around the world, but jet planes can't show you this up close. Alaska was so successful that despite the worldwide economic disaster of the 70s, we were planning to expand our fleet with 2 more ships. Then something happened. In the 80s, Alaska put us on the radar of a small company in Florida. You might have heard of them. They're called Carnival. Our partnership with Carnival immediately paid off. And instead of 2 ships, we took delivery on 12 ships in 12 years. Each one a purpose-built cruise ship. Each one built at the Fincantieri shipyards in Italy. Each one a symbol of how far we had come. Each ship to this day is a symbol of our commitment to go further, deeper, to connect people to new experiences, to make new stories. And that is a big idea and a lot of responsibility. A responsibility that we take very seriously. In 2020, we encountered a global tragedy that affected lives and communities all over the world and completely disrupted the cruise industry. In all our history, the COVID-19 pandemic was one of the biggest challenges we've ever faced. As the world and life paused, governments raced to respond. We knew what we had to do. First, we had to get our guests home. And to be honest, it was hard. One of the hardest things we've ever had to go through. But as hard as it was, we were committed to do everything and anything. And it took every single one of us, but we got it done. But our work wasn't over yet. After we got our guests home, we turned our focus to our team members. Thousands and thousands of people who come from all corners of the globe. Holland America Line was about to join the largest peacetime repatriation effort in the history of the world. With planes grounded and borders closed, it took nearly 4 months, but finally we got everyone home. And to be honest, when you need to move thousands of people, thousands of miles, and air travel is no sure thing, then it's a good time to have your own Navy. This photo was taken on June 4, 2020. And there we are, along with dozens of other ships in Manila Bay. And eventually we had ships all over the world, where we waited and hoped for a light. But now that we're all here back together, back at sea, we're perhaps most importantly once again hopeful for the future. And remember what Kay said, it's not how you come in, but how you come out. So how do we come out of this? We have always believed that there's a power in travel, that it binds us together, it helps us dream, it helps us forge new memories. And now more than ever, we are embracing our past as we move forward with a new beginning. And what better way to begin than we have often done before, with a new 7th ship called Rotterdam. Our first new build ship to be launched after the pandemic, named like so many before her after our home. A reminder of our resilience and an expression of hope that while there are times of hardship, there are also many journeys that lie ahead. And to help her in this mission, our newest Rotterdam, like every Holland America Line ship before her, has someone very special looking over her. Princess Margriet of the Netherlands, who holds the record for most Holland America Line ships christened and proudly continues this rich tradition. For thousands and thousands of years, ship captains of nearly every single world culture have looked to the heavens to protect their ships against the unknown. As recent as just a few hundred years ago, women were carved into the bow of ships to give captains better sight. Now, these days we do a little different. We have godmothers. And our tradition started with our very first ship, the Rotterdam, and she was dedicated by the captain's daughter. Our second ship, the Maasdam, was also godmothered by the captain's daughter. And since that day, every single ship had a godmother looking over her. We had actresses, television personalities, athletes, even the Olsen twins. We had 11 members of the Dutch royal family, 4 princesses and 4 queens. And Queen Wilhelmina dedicated New Amsterdam to Queen Wilhelmina, better known as the Peppermints, but she was one time Queen Wilhelmina, the richest woman in the world, the very first female billionaire. Yeah, the royal family, the Dutch royal family, may not be the flashiest, but they're one of the wealthiest and one of the most beloved. When Queen Juliana blessed Rotterdam 5, 50,000 people showed up to watch. Her daughter, Queen Beatrix, was the godmother of 2 ships, Statendam 4 and the one and only Eurodam. The current queen, Queen Maxima, not only watches over New Amsterdam, but also over Koningsdam, a ship named for her husband, King Willem-Alexander, the first male monarch in the Netherlands in over a century. And a couple of years ago, we welcomed Oprah Winfrey in our family of godmothers when she dedicated New Statendam in February 2019, sending her upon a trip of a lifetime. So, our hero story has lasted for more than 150 years, and it has been extraordinary. We survived 2 world wars, the death of the ocean liner, a Great Depression, multiple economic crises. We've circled the globe and carried generations of passengers and seen the birth of countless eras. So what do we learn from all of this besides some fun historical tidbits? There's an old saying, the pessimist complains about the wind, the optimist expects it to change, and the realist adjusts the sails. I know it's a little dry to do a sailing metaphor on a ship, but this one works because it perfectly sums up the journey of our hero, Holland America Line. With every change, every difficulty, every era, we observed, we learned, we reflected, and then we made adjustments that put us where we are today, 152 years later, stronger, wiser, and ready to continue taking people to new worlds. And I want to leave you with some last words from Mr. Bill Miller himself, because I think he says it best.
It's not about rivets or steel or carpets or artwork. It's the magic that somehow that a ship has when it comes in the beginning that just extends to everybody, and they just love it. They've been a wonderful family. They've been my friends. I've watched them come and they go, their life stories. It's like a great big maritime soap opera with all these actresses playing these parts. When I put my little head on the pillow at night, I think, the ships are still here, thank God. It's wonderful.
And so on behalf behalf of the 15,000 current employees of Holland America Line and all those who have come before, I thank you for coming this evening, and more importantly, for being part of our journey. And I'll thank you in Dutch. Dank u wel.